Welcome to BIB Today, the daily business podcast from the newsroom of business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. Now, you might expect that in the pandemic, people are taking more time to read and buying more books along the way. But the publishing business in Canada is finding itself in a worrisome, precarious state and warning of long-term risk for the sector if matters don't turn around, and very, very quickly. Kate Edwards is the executive director of the Association of Canadian Publishers, as the umbrella group for the industry. She joins me now from Toronto. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Kirk.
What are the main factors at play here?
Well, the Association of Canadian Publishers represents small and medium-sized Canadian-owned book publishers who focus on Canadian authors primarily. They're often books that have new authors or books with a more regional or specialized focus, tourism, travel, regional history. And they don't necessarily have the media attention that some of the imported books, American writers, British writers, that are the bulk of the book sales in Canada in any given year. That's what you often see on bookstore shelves. And what we've found, small publishers have found this year in particular, even more challenging is getting attention and creating the right conditions so that readers can discover those books in situations where bricks and mortar stores are either closed completely for browsing, online sales channels are focused on other products that are essential for consumers and are taking up warehouse space and delivery time. So it's been, the books are still being published, but it's been challenging this year to find an audience for those Canadian books in particular.
So what conventionally had been happening, say pre-pandemic, Kate, that now can't happen?
A big thing is book selling and the experience of whether it's an independent store or a chain store where you are presented with thousands of books in person to discover. Recommendations from a knowledgeable bookseller go a long way in building momentum, especially for some of those emerging writers or first-time writers who booksellers have their eye on. So that's one piece. The other thing that has been limited this year is the opportunity for in-person events and festivals. Festivals and reading series across Canada have been so creative and innovative in presenting different types of programming and doing things that they would never be possible, attracting audiences from a broader geography. But it's hard to hand sell books on Zoom and facilitate that sales link at the end of a presentation or reading. Yeah. So it's been it's that physical in-person element that has been missing.
Yeah, because when you go to a reading, for instance, you're I don't mean to say people are shamed into having a book, but I mean there's a little bit of peer pressure on you there to leave with a sold book, and you're not going to absorb the author's time freely if you have a conscience about you. So is there anything that can be that's working in terms of an innovation across things like Zoom in order to just get people to grab the book and pay for it, as they're learning from the author?
Yeah, and I think there is that excitement of meeting the author too in person. And publishers have been really creative this year. We have one member who was describing last week, they had experimented with this. This was in sort of a higher ed context. So an academic audience, but a reading series over the summer and into the fall with different authors who had new books coming out, presenting them as sort of a book talk. And they included at the end of the session, the publisher had a code so they could track the sales that came specifically from that event through their own website. That's one area where there has been a lot of growth this year is in direct-to-consumer sales by publishers. That infrastructure existed before the pandemic, but had been a much smaller percentage of publisher revenue. And in the absence of other sales channels, that that has really picked up this year. And with something like that, where there's an incentive to buy at the end of an event, and the possibility for the publisher to track the success of that promotion, it has been an interesting experiment that might continue in the future.
Yeah, but I want to go back a little bit, because the ailment in this sector of the publishing business hasn't suddenly emerged during the pandemic, right? There was always a kind of a frailty around our domestic publishing business in all of this. And so if you can take a look at what was happening pre-pandemic, do you already have some ideas about what has to happen post-pandemic in order to ensure that there is a stabilization of this?
Yeah, it's a really good observation, and I think the publishing industry, like so many other sectors, challenges that existed before the pandemic have been amplified. There have been adaptations and new things that people have had to do, but at the heart of it, it's the same challenges that Canadian publishers have always dealt with, which is relatively small market, a very large neighbor that to the south that produces a huge amount of cultural content each year, and that has not changed. In terms of supports that would benefit the industry, and these were certainly things that our association talked about before the pandemic. One basic element is our copyright framework. This is particular, especially in the education sector right now. There have been changes to the Copyright Act in the last 10 years that have made it difficult for creators and publishers to be compensated when their work is used in educational settings. That basic framework and legal framework needs to function for companies to be able to invest in new content and new books each year.
Is it enough, though, to do the kind of copyright reform and the rights reforms in order to, can you really make the business truly viable that way, or are there other layers of support that have to come through?
Yeah, copyright reform would be one tool in a suite of recommendations that we've made to government. The existence of a national independent publishing sector is the result of strategic government investment over many years. At the federal level, the main funding program, the Canada Book Fund, its budget has been stable but static since 2001. It's now coming up on 20 years since it's had any increase. And during that time, the industry has seen such a transformation in terms of new business models, sales channels, and for small and medium-sized Canadian companies, that government investment for companies that are competitive and reaching certain benchmarks is essential in their ability to compete with the large multinational publishers who dominate the market.
Do you get any sense at all from Ottawa that there is a willingness to examine a bit of a reset for the domestic publishing sector?
There has been wide support across all parties for a number of years for publishing support programs. That program I mentioned in particular, the Book Fund, the Standing Committee on Finance in 2016 made a recommendation that was supported across the board for an increase to the fund. The department's own evaluation of the fund last year showed that it was successful but under-resourced to meet its objectives. So there does seem to be political willingness to work with the industry and ensure it has the tools it needs to succeed. And our request now, as we look ahead to federal budget 2021, which we expect will be focused on pandemic recovery, but that it include those investments to existing programs that will be critical for recovery, especially in the cultural sector.
Can you give me a bit of a reading on, no pun intended, on when in our business, for instance, when digital came along, there was this massive promise of it reaching vast audiences and making the cost of production a lot more affordable, and somehow salvaging the economic picture of the industry that was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. But ebooks haven't done that for the printed book, have they?
No, it's been interesting this year to see publishers are really running two parallel businesses. The work that goes in, the editorial work that goes into making a book is the same often for both formats, yeah. But the market currently demands both. The bulk of Canadian publishers' sales in a typical year for our membership, more than 90% come from the sale of finished print books. At the same time, there is market demand for digital. Public libraries are a big driver of that demand. There are new developments in accessible formats for readers with print and perceptual disabilities. That is another digital format that capacity and investment is required to meet. This year, on average among our membership, ebook sales are up about 60%. It is starting from that very small or a more modest slice of the revenue pie, but we have seen a greater shift to e-reading this year, and that's also reported by public libraries who have in some cases not been able to provide access to their physical collections in the same way that they normally would. But the sales of those ebooks and the investment that's required to produce them, that increased sales revenue doesn't compensate for the loss of the print book sales that many of our members are reporting. So it doesn't, we haven't worked out that piece just yet.
Yeah. It's not commensurate with the incremental expense. You were moving around a number there in terms of a growth of digital sales, and yes, 60% on a low base is not a very high result. So let's talk about the numbers about decline in the industry year over year, and obviously as a result of the pandemic, you're witnessing quite a serious decline. What are we talking about here? 30, 40, 50, 60%?
Yeah. So I will say that the outlook for our membership has improved over the course of the year. If we had spoken in the spring, it was the forecasts were much more dire. The latest results we have from this past November, about 70% of our membership anticipated decline of at least 20%, 36% of at least 40%, and a small percentage, about 10%, expect it will be more than 60%. Some of a lot of it is quite genre specific. Company, if you're a travel and tourism publisher and do guidebooks, or a publisher who depends heavily on the tourist market, that's a big business in Atlantic Canada and also in BC. Sales have been tied with tourism, and that has not been possible this year. So they're seeing more dramatic drops in revenue. Children's books and educational books have been quite strong as categories this year, as parents have been looking for supplementary materials if they're learning at home or doing hybrid learning. So it's not an even decline across the board, but on the whole, most are expecting to see double-digit decline this year.
So what are the implications then? Does it result in consolidation in the industry a bit? Does it result in failure of certain firms? Does it mean down the road that there are far fewer Canadian authors that are getting their way into regional and national domestic publishing titles?
Yeah, and I think again, the answer to that, all of those things were possible before the pandemic. The industry has been incredibly challenging for a long time, and we have seen quite a bit of consolidation in the Canadian industry over the last 10 to 15 years. This developments related to the pandemic may accelerate that for some companies. For others, it may mean reducing staff. It may mean taking on fewer book projects each year. It may mean taking fewer risks on books that a company might be particularly passionate about but can't necessarily guarantee will sell, and that ultimately does leads to fewer opportunities for authors, especially for those niche or regional publications, fewer choices for readers in the educational market, fewer Canadian specific resources and learning materials. So the impact may not be seen overnight. This publishers are still operating and putting out books. Bookstores are still operating in different ways across the country, but over time, the capacity may erode in order to bring those books out to market.
And my recollection of the industry, doesn't it also qualify for grants on the basis of having a certain amount of titles that have been published in the last number of years? So if there are fewer titles, that then presages fewer grants.
Yeah, there are different eligibility requirements for different programs. Some are based on title output. Some are based on a sales threshold. These are discussions that we're having with different funders who do recognize that this is an exceptional year and one that has really affected companies' ability to earn revenue in the way that they normally would. So we are, and they have expressed a lot of willingness to be flexible and look at different scenarios in the short term, but over the long term, the way those programs are designed, it's too early to tell if that will change.
In an ideal but still pragmatic future, what does that reset look like for the industry? What would exist in the way of a support network? What would be the programs that would stabilize the industry to give Canadian authors a greater opportunity to get their work to the public?
Yeah. So adequate and consistent direct support to publishers would be one thing. We've talked more during the pandemic as more shift. There's been greater shift to online book selling, both with large companies like Chapters Indigo, but also independents. So infrastructure support for bookstores is something that is being discussed with greater frequency. Things like postal subsidies, which most other developed countries do have in place to support their booksellers. The cost, as an example of shipping a typical book, it's often $10 to $15, which might be the price of the book. So there are infrastructure supports there to support the network of bookstores across the country that would help. Purchase of Canadian books by Canadian public institutions like schools and libraries. This is something that we continue to talk about, and it's there could be greater focus on our own books and literature through our public institutions. All of those different threads would come together to help bolster the domestic industry and ultimately bring Canadian writing to the broadest public possible.
Okay, well then last question on this one. I might as well talk about the two elephants that get in the room with you. One being Amazon, the other one being Chapters Indigo. How could they serve the interests of the industry better, you think? What would be your advice into them about how it is that they can provide support for domestic publishing?
Yeah, and we've had good discussions with both of those retailers over the years, and especially this year. Chapters Indigo has been placing greater focus on local content, and you see that. And unfortunately, many of us can't get into bookstores physically in certain parts of the country, but that's also starting to show up on their online store as well. Regional showcases that highlight local books, trying to create that feeling of a local bookstore online. So that, and the early results of that merchandising has been quite fruitful, and something that we hope will continue, and that we can work in partnership with the chain. And Amazon, a big challenge this year with their service is that they are not they are not a bookseller. They sell everything. And when there's high demand from online shopping, on online infrastructure, and fulfillment of all types of goods, books, are one of the many basket that are provided. So that has been a big challenge. Greater highlighting and identification of Canadian authors in the book section of Amazon.ca is something that's there already and can always be enhanced. Email merchandising and marketing of those titles helps, because lots of people are shopping there and then their eyes are on that website. So more, it's all about discoverability.
Yeah. Well, look, hope people do discover some books for the holiday season. We're all kind of indoors. It's not like we're out there having big parties. And we're learning how to cook again. And there are a lot of reasons why you should be having a book this holiday season, or 2 or 3.
Reading is a great activity for social isolation, self-isolation and social distancing. So buy local and buy often.
All right. Well, stay safe and well, Kate. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Kirk. Take care.
Kate Edwards is the Executive Director of the Association of Canadian Publishers. You've been watching BIV Today. I'm Kirk LaPointe, Publisher and Editor-in-Chief at Business in Vancouver. Thanks. We'll see you again.